the one thing that I've seen, like if you could say out of all 10 things, the external factors, the internal factors, if there's, you mentioned that it might need a combination of multiple to actually cause someone to run out of money. I know one of them that has caused people, I've watched it draw people's portfolios down to zero. That by itself, I know I keep coming back to that, but like that's the only one out of all 10 that I've seen that one by itself draw people down to zero.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is spooky.
All right, Zacc Call is back, president of Capita Financial Network. Thank you for being back here because your videos have been so well received and your information is so great. So we have some other topics that we really want to address with retirees and personally for those who are not necessarily to retirement yet. What can we do now to kind of prepare for ourselves? So before we go too crazy into this, a lot of channels or videos will save the meat for later about what it's all about to get the watch time up. Just tell us right now, what do we need to expect from this episode?
Sure, especially since we'll probably go for a while, right?
Yeah.
Okay, today we're talking about withdrawal planning, retirement income strategy, structuring your wealth so that you can avoid the major risks in retirement. And the main thing you need to understand here is that there are some external factors you cannot control. There are some internal factors of which you are in complete control. And then there are strategies for structuring your retirement income. And they really only boil down to what I call now and later money or multi-stream strategies. So that's the order in which we're going to go through this today. The key thing that people need to walk away and understand is that you cannot control the external factors. You can't decide how much inflation will be. You can't decide what the government's going to do with your tax rates other than your voting, right? Yeah. You really have very little control over these first 5 external risks or factors. And the reality is they're not going to make or break your situation either. People are really, really afraid of markets, of inflation, of taxes. And the reality is those usually don't make people run out of money. I've never met anybody that ran out of money because taxes were too high. Mm-hmm. I've absolutely met a lot of people who have run out of money because they can't control how much money they're giving to their kids. Mm. And so that's that middle section of what are the internal decision-making situations that you get into, not the external risks, but your own, like what's in your power that is impacting your ability to have enough money throughout retirement and then also making sure that you hit your goals. So it might not be the risk of running out. It might be the risk of not enjoying life enough and you end up dying with too much money. So that's all in that middle category of what's within your control. So in other words, get to the meat at the end. I'm going to tell you, I wouldn't overly stress about the external risks, things like investment performance. If you're doing well, it's going to be fine, and you don't need to stress entirely about markets as much or taxes or inflation. Like, yes, you need a really thought out strategy to manage those external risks, but your biggest risk is yourself in many ways. Like those internal factors are so much more impactful to the question of will I run out of money? And so we'll talk about those as well. And then lastly, it's just a knowledge thing where you may structure the portfolio in a way you think is a bucket approach or a now and later money approach, but the way that you actually take the money out is not working. In other words, I know countless people who sell stocks after they're down just because they're on an automatic monthly withdrawal that takes money out of the portfolio proportionately. So it's a mistake that people make without even knowing that they're making, and many people will go their entire retirement and pass away and never know that they even made a mistake. So it's something we want to at least expose the issue and provide what we believe to be a superior option.
This is so interesting when you phrase that. This kind of clicked in my head because it was like the external factors. It seems like if you turn on the TV or you watch YouTube videos or whatever it is, it's so focused on, hey, your taxes are going to go up and out of control. The market's so volatile, everything is good or bad or whatever else it is. I rarely hear, hey, don't spend so much. Like stop buying things in terms of like, because all of the marketing and ads and the consumer market of where we live, I mean, it is what it is. And then the last part in my mind is almost one of those things where it's like, it's over my head. I almost personally bury my head in the sand, like you guys take care of it for me. So it's interesting to, as you were talking through those, of just the mindset around it all.
The problem, yeah, you're right. The problem is that even on this last category, advisors are not doing it necessarily the best. So I'm just throwing it out there. Like, you might say, oh, this is over my head, but I actually think the consumer needs to understand the structure of what's being proposed to them, because the structure itself is sometimes wrong.
Yeah.
So if you can improve the structure, or at least understand how the structure is going to pan out. So I'm being kind of vague, but the point is, don't sell investments at a loss every month on your automatic withdrawal. Like, that's what I'm trying to get at here. We're going to explain how to avoid that, but I can't tell you. I mean, most retirement income plans either over limit your access by going too heavy on the insurance side and locking up your money forever to guarantee you that you'll never lose money ever. Or on the other side, they're a diversified portfolio where they sell growth assets every single month for their cash flow. And I think both of those are a mistake.
Yeah. And
there has to be a way to solve for that. And there is. There are ways to do it where you're not experiencing either of those mistakes. There's a huge benefit in flexibility and access, and the ability to change your mind about how much money you spend, or how you spend your money in general, or who you give your money to. And when you lock it all up, those rights are taken away from you. And then also on the other side, there has to be a way to not sell investments at a loss every month. Yeah. So anyway, we'll get into that, but the external factors are for sure scary. So let's just take a step back.
Before we jump into that too quick, I do want to note, because of past videos and stuff, this is not financial advice for individuals, right? Like, we're going to talk about these concepts as a whole, kind of functionally how they all work. But as we dive into the demographics of people who watch this, we were talking about this a little bit. We have people who are 18 years old all the way up to a 106-year-old.
I cannot believe that.
106-year-old watched our other video. So the age range here is hugely different. And then also the assets that people have. Some are just starting their careers. Others have multiple millions of dollars. So don't take this as financial advice. Reach out to a financial advisor if you have questions around this specifically for you.
If you're that 106-year-old, like, good for you, because I'm 39 and Eric's teaching me about YouTube, and you're 106 and you're on YouTube consuming. That's just fantastic.
She's amazing. Like, I know her personally.
Oh, you do?
We did a video with her. She's amazing. She's in great shape. That'll be a different conversation.
Cool.
She exercises every day. Awesome. Okay, so take us through the external factors. What do we got to worry about?
Yeah, and I guess the point I wanted to first make was I don't want to be dismissive of these external factors, because they're not minute. It's not like it's not something you can ignore. And we'll go through each one. And I also want people who are feeling the fear associated with government decision making, taxes, policy around inflation, like, those are all really big. That's a big deal. So I'm not saying they're not a big deal. They're just not as much in your control.
Yeah.
So that's the point, is what's within your control and what's not. So as we go through this, we'll just hit them. So longevity, that meaning you live so long. You're the 106-year-old gal that you're talking about, that you live so long that you just live longer than you expected, and you planned for your money to basically run out in your 90s, but you lived another 16 years. Good for her. That is longevity risk. It is. I'm going to say something that's kind of sad, but I just think people don't live as long as they model out in the retirement income planning tools and analysis. We always model out the most conservative situation. So a financial planner is going to model out, well, what if you live really long? What if you live to 90, 95, 100, where, a lot of people end up passing away in their 70s and 80s. And so you have to think about that. When you think about longevity, you also have to think about, if you're married, it's actually a really high, the probability of one of you making it to your 90s is really high. Imagine you flip a coin, and before you get two chances to flip a coin, and before you flip it either time, you have to place a bet on whether or not you're going to get a heads once. It doesn't matter. It's just get a heads once between the two flips. Well, that probability is actually pretty decent. You've got two shots at it, right?
Yeah.
If you only have one shot at it, it's 50-50. That's easy. But two shots at it, the probability is not 50-50. Yeah. It's actually a lot higher that you get that opportunity. So the point is the same with somebody making it into their 90s. If you're a couple, the odds of one of you making it there is actually pretty high. Mm-hmm. And so you have to think about longevity that way. But oddly enough, one of my biggest concerns is that people worry about running out of money so much that they don't live a life that they could have in the meantime. So we'll talk about that later too, but that's longevity. Investments is the next one. And what we mean by investments is poor investment decision-making, not volatility of the overall market. I'm talking about like you put all your money into one investment and it went belly up. That investment decision-making, or for example, you sell after the market drops and you lock in losses that you never make back. Those types of investment decisions, or you put it all in some really illiquid thing that is a private investment that ends up going under. I mean, there's a lot of different ideas, or all in one stock publicly. I mean, you get the idea. But that's more of like investment failure, not investment volatility. So that's item 2, is just investment risk, let's call it. Item 3 is probably the most complicated for us to try to explain, but it's also probably the one that matters the most to people. And it is the fact that there's normal volatility in investments. Anybody who builds a reasonably diversified portfolio will have some ups and downs in that portfolio. The next risk is called sequence of returns. And all it is those ups and downs are going to happen. Did the downs happen early in retirement for you, in the middle, or at the end? If the downs happen at the end, it is not a big deal. If the downs happen in the middle, I mean, if we divide your retirement, a 30-year retirement, into 3 decades, if it's in the second or third decade that a time like the 2008 real estate crisis happens, it's not fun, and you're not like sleeping well at night, but it doesn't really cause you to run out of money. If it happens in the first decade and you are overly exposed to it, that is a massive problem. So it's the order. And a way to best describe this is, and you know me, I'm kind of a math nerd. So I like to explain things with numbers, but I did see this play out in 2008 when people were retiring in 2007 and 2008. And at that time, I worked at a previous employer, and my job was to help oversee their investment strategy. And they started taking maybe a 4 or a 5% withdrawal from the portfolio. And then the markets dropped and their portfolios went down, in some cases, 20, 25%, because the market went down 50%, right? And they weren't all invested in the stock market, but the portfolios went down pretty substantially. Well, then a 25% reduction in the portfolio, if I still maintain the same withdrawal percentage, means that I need to cut their expenses from the portfolio, their withdrawals, by about 25% as well. So, imagine you're taking out $20,000 from the portfolio, and I'm now telling you, okay, you can only take $15,000 a year from the portfolio. That's a big deal, especially if it was $2,000 a month and now it's $1,500 a month. And life's not getting cheaper. So anyway, that's difficult, and that was hard, and a lot of people don't change their expenses. So then what that means is they're selling more of the portfolio while it's down. And that's the sequence of return. That's the story that I saw play out in 2007, 8, and 9 quite a bit. But the math, why does this matter? So let's say you have a $100,000 portfolio. And you get a 10% return, a positive return. Well, now it's $110,000. Then you get a 10% loss. Well, it's $110,000. 10% of that is $11,000. So now you're down to $99,000. So you started with 100, 10% gain, 10% loss, 99,000 finish. So what if we flip the returns? We go -10, then +10. Same idea. Start with 100,000. -10, we're down to 90, right? Because we lose $10,000. We get a 10% return. Well, you started with 90,000. A 10% return is only going to give you $9,000 back up. And again, we're back to $99,000. So if you watched the last video about Roth and traditional, I don't know, I feel like I'm this weird guy that does this thing. I'm like, look at all this fancy math. It doesn't matter.
It's the same.
But the point I'm trying to make here is that you could pick any set of returns in any order. And if there's no cash flow in or out of the portfolio, the end dollar amount will be the same, as long as the portfolio experiences the exact same returns in whatever order you want.
Yeah.
And that's confusing to people at times. So the reason I mention that is because like if you could throw in a 20% gain, a 5% loss, and then a 5% loss and a 20% gain, same scenario, you end up with the same dollar amount. Now, here's what matters. If you start introducing any cash flow in or out of the portfolio, all of a sudden it changes the game entirely. So if you have a 10% gain and then you take a withdrawal, well, a lot of that withdrawal is just icing on the cake. That was the growth, right?
Yeah.
Versus if you start with a 10% loss and then you take money out, well, now you're not only taking your principal, you're taking it off a smaller balance. You're kind of cutting it down. And then now the next year's growth that I'm talking about like $100,000 portfolio. And if you take out $1,000 after a loss, well, that $1,000 doesn't get the growth and you're going to end up with a different balance. So anyway,
we'll have this up for people to see that too.
Yeah, and reality is $1,000. Maybe I'll change this really quick, and that way you can use that as the example. But because most people are not withdrawing 1% of the portfolio, but basically I put in a $5,000 withdrawal, and the end balance is $1,000 different.
Yeah,
that's not a huge deal to have your balance be 1% different between the two scenarios. It is a big deal when it's only 2 years, though, and it's 1% different, because if we have another table where we're talking about sequence where it really matters.
This really blew my mind the first time I saw it.
Yeah.
Because I never understood, no one had explained it to me until you guys did, and I was just like, whoa, like that's...
And we planners geek out about this. So just so you know, this is why when we run an analysis of whether or not someone's going to run out of money, they want a straight answer of like, well, am I or am I not? Yeah. It's like, well, I have to run 1,000 scenarios and then throw the market returns in all kinds of crazy orders, compare that against historical returns of your portfolio, the way we're structuring it, and then we give you this funny number. We're like, well, it's probably 90% probability that you will be fine and 10% that you won't. And that's not true either. We'll get into that. But anyway, people want a hard answer, and this is the reason it's difficult, is because we ran, so this is 25 years, and I think this study may have been a Fidelity one. I can't remember. But this is a chart produced by someone else, not us, but 25 years. And if you go through a sequence of returns where the gains are at the beginning, that portfolio starts at 100,000. You're withdrawing. I think it was 5,000. 5,000. So 5% withdrawal. And by the way, the average return is 6.2% in both scenarios.
Yeah.
But the early gain ends with $205,000 left over. So you started with 100, withdrew 5% per year, and then you die with $205,000. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Like, great. Okay, the same returns, the same market conditions, just in a different order. And you start with 100,000 and you run out in year 18.
Yeah.
You never get to year 25. And it's because the losses happened early. So this is, I know we paused, this was only item 3 out of our 5. It's the one that people probably misunderstand the most and need to understand because it dictates how you structure a portfolio more than anything else.
Well, and you mentioned it's an external factor, right? Like when you decide to retire, you can't predict the next 25 years. You can't predict the next 5 or 10. I think the psychology of money talks about this a lot. Of those who chose to retire in 2008 have a much different life than those who chose to retire 10 years later.
Right.
So it's just, it's pretty wild there. Does this come into the play? This was kind of big news all over the place with the Dave Ramsey saying you should take out a certain percentage. Does this kind of tie into that at all? Yeah,
it does. And we're going to talk a little bit about a mistake I think that he spoke and said. But before that, I mean, no one has done more for the individual within a financial crisis than Dave Ramsey's tough love. So let's just like give him some credit for what he's done. A lot of financial advisors and wealth managers don't really focus on the people who are in trouble financially because there's not a lot of opportunity to take them on as a customer. So, I mean, kudos to Dave Ramsey for really targeting the masses that need the help, giving them some tough love. And part of his approach is tough love. So sometimes he says things that may seem a little radical. So he came out and said that you should be getting a 12% portfolio return, and inflation, if it's at 4%, you should be able to take out 8% per year. The problem with that is it only works if the return is constant and exactly 12% every year. It doesn't work if the 12% is comprised of a -25, a +40, -3, +18. You know, if you have that type of volatility, and by the way, to get a 12% rate of return, you need to subject yourself to a decent amount of volatility because, you know, the stock market long-term has been between 10 and 12. And so the stock market long-term experiences about a 14.6% drop every year. So that's something to be, I mean, just buckle up, folks. Like that's part of the game.
Yeah.
But it is positive most years. So it's one of those situations where if you went to Vegas and there was one blackjack table that had 70+% odds of walking away winning. Obviously, it's not. I mean, the house has a slight advantage there, right?
Yeah.
But if you had a 70+% advantage, like I would quit my job and I would sit at the table constantly. And every time I lost, I'd be like, it doesn't matter. I'm going to win 70% of the time. I'll just stay here. I just don't bet the whole farm on one hand and I'll be fine. And that is the stock market. Yeah. It's just harder to conceptualize that way. But the point is that back to Dave Ramsey's comment, to get a 12% rate of return, you have to be okay temporarily losing money. And you might be emotionally okay with it. Like maybe you're just got nerves of steel and you're the individual that their risk tolerance is 110 out of 100. You know, maybe that's the way you feel about it. Well, it doesn't really matter how you feel if your money doesn't have enough time to wait. So there's a difference between your risk capacity and your risk tolerance. Yeah. And young people, it's all the same. They have a high capacity, and so it's like the younger you are, the portfolio should be more based on your tolerance. The older you are, the portfolio should be based more on your capacity. Because you might be really tolerant, but if you have to take money out of the portfolio to live, it doesn't matter how you felt about it. You still pulled money out when the market was down because you lived on it.
Yeah.
So anyway, the problem we run into is that you go back to studies done years ago and they say, okay, well, what is the percentage you can take out if you were to live 30 years? And let's mark all of the different 30-year periods over, hundreds of years. What is the percentage you could take and never have to worry about running out of money? And the consensus came back through studies, and it's been debated over and over again that 4% is the number. So if you've heard the 4% rule, that's what they're talking about. They're saying, we're going to go back and look at every 30-year window. And if you were to take 4% and then increase it with inflation over time, you'll be fine in a moderate growth or moderate portfolio. Usually they're modeling in like a portfolio of 60% stocks, 40 bonds. So here you have somebody saying, well, you should earn 10 or 12% return, 4% inflation, take out 8 every year. And then you have a bunch of researchers and people in the industry saying the rule is 4%. And I remember hearing rumors that investment returns with bond rates being lower than they were in the 80s, you really should be looking at 3 or 3.5%. And I actually think they're as bad on the other side, that there is a middle ground here. There are definitely ways to take more than 4% from a portfolio. But once again, going back to your comment about everything's different. If I'm talking to somebody who's 75 years old, the 4% rule is worthless. They don't have nearly the time that they have to make that money last, right? But if we're talking to somebody retiring at 55, well, then they're going to need to withdraw a lot less. Yeah. Okay, so it's all personalized, right? So that was a long explanation of sequence of returns. Again, hand it to Ramsey and his team for everything they've done for the folks in financial crisis. I don't agree with the idea of withdrawing 8%. I think it's too risky. Even the best ways to model it with multi-stream income and now in later money that we'll talk about later, I can't see it working very well for most people for a 30-year period.
Yeah, and this isn't the whole point of this one, but maybe you could address too, because it was really quick and it wasn't played in most of the stuff, where I think it was Rachel, his daughter, who was saying well, what if you don't make it 12%? What if you make it 10? And then he's like, well, 4%, take that out for inflation and then take 6. And so how is that still problematic of taking that? Is that tying into this sequence of returns
that's
concept
actually,
as well?
I like that strategy. I like that concept. Yeah. Most people are not willing to adjust their spending like that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I actually very much respect that. In fact, I have found that that's one of the best ways to increase the initial withdrawal percentage. So in other words, if you don't like the 4% rule, then you can make a trade-off. You can say, okay, I can start spending way more than 4% if in the future I'm willing to adapt it down. The 4% rule is designed for somebody who's kind of like hopping in an airplane, putting it on autopilot, and sitting in the back, and there's no pilot up front. Now, if you're willing to make adjustments along the flight path, then you can start with a higher percentage than 4.
Gotcha.
So yeah, so that, and what Rachel, I don't know, is that her name maybe?
I think so.
Okay. What she's talking about there is the mid-flight adjustment.
Yeah.
If that can be done, then you can start with a much higher withdrawal percentage. I guess my question is, I usually don't go as high as 8. When things are really good, I don't like to take the entire growth of the portfolio, because if you leave a little bit of the growth as a buffer, that means you can still withdraw when you actually lose. So I guess my question in that scenario is, what would they do when the market goes down 25% and their portfolio goes down 10 or 15 or 20? Then would they deposit money? Because that math, you know, inflation at 4% minus, are you going to deposit 24% into the portfolio? You know what I mean? Like, that's where I'd start to wonder. Maybe they would just completely stop spending. For some retirement income situations, that might be fine. If you have a pension, Social Security, and your withdrawals from your account are just icing on the cake, that might work for you. But if all you have is your withdrawals from the portfolio, it's really hard to just live on nothing for a year.
Yeah. Well, that was an awesome breakdown of sequence of returns there.
I hope so. It's a weird concept to try to understand. Let's keep going though. So the other one is inflation, and this is number 4.
Of external factors that you don't have real control over.
You got it. Good summary. Inflation is a scary one. It has been a non-issue for almost 10, 15 years until this last year or so, when we finally saw numbers in the 8 to 9% range over a 12-month period. But we've been modeling in inflation of 2 or 3 or sometimes more percent in terms of how much our expense is going to go up. And we just haven't seen that. We've seen it at near 0 to 1 and 2 for the last decade and change, which has been interesting. Now, we finally saw an 8 or a 9%, which some people take that and say, see, it's going to be awful. It's going to be 8 or 9% forever. There's a recency bias in that. Like, we think what's happened recently is what will happen forever. If you look, it was 8 or 9% recently, but if we take the average of that 8 or 9% over the last 12 months plus 15 years of near 0, then the average is actually fairly low for a while. I do think inflation is coming. We all feel it right now. Goldman just actually put out their projection on overall markets and their projections. So it's right now, I don't know when people will be watching this, but it's December in 2023.
Yeah.
And they put out their overall projections, and they feel as though the government has done a good job to stave off more inflation by keeping rates as high as they have. And they actually talked about a potential for the government next year to be able to decrease rates a little bit. And so they talked positively, not like super optimistically, but positively about things. So in other words, that's a quick explanation of inflation. And it is an issue. It matters. And specifically, so I'm just going to talk about some, there's inflation, and then there's your withdrawal inflation, not the same number.
Explain.
Okay, so let's say somebody has $100,000 worth of expenses, and most people have Social Security income. But for the sake of keeping math easy, we're going to pretend they don't. Okay, all they have is $100,000 of expenses, and they are going to take all $100,000 from their investment portfolios, and that's all they have. So if inflation is, let's say we model out 2.5%, then next year they need to take out $102,500, right? Because of 2.5% inflation growth. Okay, that's about as simple as it comes, where the actual inflation on expenses matched the increased withdrawal you needed to take from your portfolio. Okay, but what if somebody has the same situation? What if they have $100,000 of expenses, but they have Social Security income for, let's say they have Social Security income for $50,000 between the couple,
Yeah.
And then they also have a pension of $40,000, like a pension that doesn't go up with inflation at all. Social Security does get cost of living adjustments, but we never model in that they'll be as kind to keep up with inflation with that, right? So we'll model in a really low number on that, but that their expenses are going up faster and their pension's not going up at all. Okay, so they have $90,000 of income that's not climbing. Let's say you model out 2.5% inflation on the expenses. So we know it went from 100 to 102, right? 102,500.
Yeah.
And their 90,000 of income maybe went up to 91 or 92. So they are not climbing. Their fixed income is not climbing very fast. Their total income or total expenses are going up by inflation. So the gap between the two is getting bigger faster. So their actual rate at which they have to increase their withdrawals from their portfolio might be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% when inflation is only 2 or 3. So that's a weird concept. Again, weird math. And we run into this all the time. And it's one of the reasons I actually struggle and get frustrated with a lot of financial planning software, because a lot of the software will either oversimplify it and they will say, all right, inflation's 2, so the withdrawals will go up by 2, everything's going up by 2. It's like, well, no. First of all, I want their fixed income to not go up because some of it doesn't. And their withdrawals we need to model out like a 4 or 5% increase on how much they're taking from their portfolios to keep up with a 2% overall inflation. Anyway, so the tools, so inflation is not just like the external factor. It's, are you actually modeling out the right retirement income picture? Because your withdrawal inflation might be higher than actual inflation.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a weird situation that we run into. Okay, and then the last one is dramatic changes in taxes. So
this is a hot button here.
You are not kidding. We did the Roth and traditional video, and I feel like this was probably the biggest, like, tax rates are absolutely going up. And by the way, we agree. Like, I just want to deflect a few arrows.
Just watch
there.
a little bit further in that video.
We're with you. We do think tax rates are going up. The point was, like, what do you think will happen? And that should help you make your decision around that. But we're with you. Tax rates are likely to go up. A lot of people who make $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year in retirement only show $100,000 to $200,000. Sorry, let me start. I said that wrong. You're looking at me like you knew. But $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000 working. They oftentimes only show $100,000 or $200,000 in retirement. So although the tax rates for each bracket may go up, you may drop a couple brackets, and so your tax rate may go down. So it's not as simple as to say, the government will increase tax rates, therefore I will pay more in taxes, because you may drop brackets. So that's part of the tricky part. Now, once you're in retirement, usually you don't change brackets too frequently. You start to find a groove and you end up in that bracket for the most part. And the reality is there are so many voters in the bottom 3 tax brackets, in the 10% right now, 12 and 22. After 2025, it'll be 10, 15, and 25. So that's a change, meaning, yes, we know tax rates are going up. In 2026, they're for sure going up. And I think a lot of people in the comments are saying, oh, they're going through the roof. And the reality is that's true. The top tax bracket was 90% back, decades ago. I mean, can you imagine thinking, like, if I earn another $1, I have to pay 90 cents of it away in taxes federally, and then your state on top of that? It's not worth it anymore. So the point is, that was the top bracket. Those first 3 brackets, you're somewhat insulated. You're a big voting population. You're not going to be put in a spot where you have to. I just don't think you're at as much risk as somebody in the next 3 tax brackets.
I think that's an important distinction to make, though, is that, again, taxes are always harped on for better or worse or whatever in media outlets. And so it's that marginal tax thing is an important
and most retirees end up in the bottom 3 tax brackets. You end up kind of, like, let's talk about just the company that you're in that bottom 3 tax brackets. You've got young couples absolutely struggling to pay for homes. And, you may have a mortgage that's $500 to $1,000, but their mortgage is $4,000 for the same house. Like they are struggling, and you're in the same boat as them from a tax standpoint. From like when you look at your 1040, it looks the same as theirs in terms of how wealthy or how well off you are. I think the government can't really hit you too hard, or else they hit a lot of really, really struggling families, and then they have upheaval in the voting.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, that's great. Does that cover, it looks like, the 5 reasons that are external factors that you would run out of money? Is there anything else you would want to add?
Other than summarizing them, I wouldn't
summarize
add it.
them for us.
Okay, because there's a lot. So we talked about longevity risk. You just live a really long time.
Yeah.
And good for you.
Yeah.
And we talked about investment decision risk. And that's just you put it all in one thing or you put it in something poor and it just didn't perform well. Then the third one is also investment related, but you didn't do anything wrong. The market just moved up and down at the wrong time for you. Yeah. That's sequence of returns risk. That's the one we spent a lot of time on. And then inflation. So that was number 4. How fast are things getting more expensive for you? And based on your composition of your other income, is your withdrawal inflation a lot higher than actual inflation, or is it pretty close to actual inflation? Okay. And then number 5 is taxes, a dramatic change in taxes. All 5 of these are factors. All 5 of these should be managed. All 5 of these are important. Most of these aren't going to make you run out of money.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like as you go through those, if one of them happens, the odds of one of those happening to a degree where it will just ruin you doesn't seem super high. But if multiple of those happen all at once, then things start to get a bit crazy.
They talk about taxes. If you're in the second or third tax bracket, and the fact that tax rates rise destroys your retirement, it just destroyed the retirement of millions of Americans at the same time.
Yeah.
Like you can't imagine how terrible that would be for governments and for politicians. Yeah. So like there's that, to your point, like there's probably not one of these that's going to absolutely ruin you, except for that you pick a really, really risky investment and it just fails.
Yeah.
But that goes back to, that is within your control. Right?
Let's get to that. What are the things, I guess, the mistakes that people could make that are in their control that will cause them to lose money?
Yeah. Okay. So the first one is actually not to cause them to lose money, right? So we have 5 things, the mistakes they could make. Most people are more concerned about running out of money than dying with too much, right? So that's why we end up talking about that more. However, and if you actually drill down to what people care about, most people will say, here's my priority list. Don't want to run out of money. I want to have enough that if I end up in a long-term care situation or end-of-life expenses are pretty heavy for the last year or 2 of my life, like I want to have enough money there to cover that. Some people will insure against that, or they basically say I'm self-insured because I have enough money for that. So we're talking about just building up nest eggs and having enough money, right?
Yeah.
So we'll just talk about it that way. So don't want to run out, want to have enough that if I get to the end of the life, I don't want my kids to be burdened, or if I don't have kids, I need to have enough to take care of myself. And then after that, usually they basically say, I'd like to bounce my last check as I lay down in the coffin. Like that's what they're hoping for, right?
Yeah.
There are some people who have this other, instead of that third priority, they're saying, I'd like to also pass on money to my kids. Or, there's two different schools of thoughts there. Some people will say, I want to make sure each of my kids get $1 million or each of my kids get $100,000, and they're very passionate about that. But most people, it's an afterthought. They say, I need to make sure I have enough. I need to make sure that I'm independent all the way through the end of my life. And if the kids get something, great. I don't really care. They're fine. And in many cases, they'll joke, they're making way more money than I ever did. and I will tell them, and you know what? They're going to spend your money a lot faster than you ever did too. So don't stress too much about that. But anyway, the point is,
I guess it's the 2 philosophies of have something left over or die with nothing.
Yeah. And the reality is, if we could predict everything perfectly, a lot of people would actually choose to die with nothing. But because we can't predict your life expectancy and markets and a whole bunch of factors, it's good to have a buffer.
Yeah.
So they usually will die with something. So the point is, the mistake 1 is you live for the future too much, that you end up dying with so much money that we look back and think, gosh, I really wish they would have enjoyed their life a little bit more. And the irony in all of this is, we we call it the go-go years, the slow-go years, and the no-go years. If we're dividing that 30-year period into 3 decades, your first decade is the go-go, middle decade is slow-go, and then last decade is no-go. So the irony in all of this, and the part that I feel for retirees, is because the first decade is the one that has the highest sequence of returns risk, the highest risk of markets performing poorly and impacting your retirement. It's also the go-go year, so it's when you have the best health.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, oh, that's the year we want to spend the most. But mathematically, it's the year that if you spend the most, creates the biggest risk on running out. So there's a balance to be found there. But I do think a lot of people die with too much money.
Well, and this was an interesting concept that was brought. I keep referring to The Psychology of Money because I really like that book. But
Morgan Housel's amazing. The way that he can connect with people on the way people feel and think about money, and the way money actually works is unreal. And so if people don't know about it, it's Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money, that you've read. Keep going.
Well, and he talks about when you were born and when you experience those things. So people who were born or lived through the Great Depression, or maybe their parents lived through the Great Depression, and now you're telling them, hey, be optimistic about the stock market, when they lived through the worst. Like it's hard psychologically to tell people to do that.
Oh, yeah.
And to not penny pinch and to not save everything for the worst case scenario. And then you get the people that were the last 20 years or so where everything was positive. Like everything's going great, pretty much zero inflation or very little inflation, stock market's doing great. To tell them like, hey, hold on a little bit, like back off is hard psychologically.
Yeah, we don't know how to conceptualize what those folks went through because they went through more than a decade of non-positive Dow Jones, like the Dow Jones being under its high, so meaning it came down and didn't reach that new high point for more than I think it was about a decade. Yeah. I don't think we understand how that works. Yeah. Like that's hard for us to conceptualize. I mean, can you imagine being 10 years later? Most people give up on an investment in 1 or 2 or 3 years if it's not positive. Not a decade to 15 years, right? Yeah. We don't understand quite how that felt. That's
so we talk about like this is a mistake for living for the future too much, but I just want to say, like, empathetically, we can see that of like, it makes sense why people would think this, but here's kind of why that's a mistake.
Yeah, and times are different as well. Yeah. There are certain things in place with markets and the Fed, and you can see the action in how they control the money supply and interest rate policy and Fed fund rates, between banks. I mean, there's so many things going on there, and data is so much better now. I mean, imagine how they found out about the health and strength of the economy in the 30s. They're not getting, I mean, there's so much data now available. I'm not saying that that's good or bad. I'm just saying it is a tool that allows our government to step in and put guardrails and kind of like, the bumper and the lanes at the bowling alley. Yeah. It keeps us out of the gutter a little bit better.
Nice.
Okay. So living for the future can be a problem. It's probably a lesser problem for a lot of people. They're like, I'm much more concerned about running out of money. So let's move on to that one.
Yeah.
I just want to point out that there are some people, and maybe real quick, it's oftentimes the people who oversaved throughout their career as well. They psychologically struggle. It feels like a one-way street. My father-in-law jokes about this, where it's like, the accounts are supposed to be a one-way street. You put money in, and then all of a sudden you have to then flip the switch and feel okay about taking money back. That was a sin for the last 30 years to take any money out of your savings. Yeah. And now all of a sudden, I mean, these people suffered in order to ensure that one-way street continued going in one direction.
So much ramen and beans.
Exactly. And then all of a sudden now you're telling me to take it out to pay for a flight? Like that. I lived on ramen and beans, and I'm paying for a flight. Anyway, you get the idea. Overspending. Okay, so this is the exact opposite scenario. Not understanding your limits and overspending.
Would you say this is more common than the first one we just talked about? People having a problem overspending than saving too much?
Yeah, in the accumulators, for sure. Yeah. In the retirees, I don't think so. Yeah. So this is hard because I'm talking about what I see, which is my clients. Yeah. Our clients oftentimes underspend. I think they actually could, and I'm saying on average, right? We have 2,300 households, and we do have clients that overspend, and we counsel them and help them understand the limits of what's going to happen if they continue. But I would say that's probably 3 to 5%. Okay. The rest are probably underspending a little bit.
Interesting.
Now, flip the switch though, 30-year-olds. we are probably overspending and not saving enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that's a problem. But let's just move on, because the lack of discipline on this is just knowing your boundaries. And by the way, we have a different approach to this. We think that we should be telling people how much they should spend in retirement. Most financial planners ask the client, how much do you want to spend in retirement? And they say, I'd like to have $10,000 a month or $8,000 a month. And then they start building up like, okay, well, you have this much in Social Security, you have this much in a pension, and here's your income gap, and darn it, your account's not big enough for that. And then they tell them, you can't retire. I think that's a mistake.
Yeah.
I think it's not that you can't retire. It's you can retire today with X amount of income, or you can retire tomorrow or next year with this amount of income. You can retire in 5 years with this amount of income. It's not can you retire, it's how much income can you retire on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's a different framing. I think it helps people feel more confident in their retirement decision too.
Well, if you anchor to like, hey, I would love to have $50,000 a month in retirement, and then the psychological disappointment of, well, you're nowhere near that.
Isn't that funny?
Like,
we see people who are glad to live on $9,000 or $8,000 or $6,000 a month. But we as the experts are asking them to come up with a number, and they arbitrarily pull 10 sounds great.
Yeah.
And then the end of the conversation turns into, sorry, you can't do it.
Yeah.
That's it. It's like, well, you could have, and they're fine with 6, 7, or 8. Anyway, you get the idea. Okay, overspending. The next problem is much more related to family and its kids. And this is hard. I'm seeing this because my daughter's starting to drive. And I'm thinking through like, well, I'm paying for the car, the insurance, the gas. At what point do I make her pay for gas? At what point do I make her pay for insurance? And at what point do I make her buy her own car? Yeah. And I don't know yet. She's my oldest, but I see a lot.
Well, if this helps you, I'm 35. And I just got our first cell phone plan with me and my wife. We were on parent plans.
Oh, is that
so? And a lot of this was because our parents were like, no, like just stay. It's cheaper for us to have this rather than to have two people on one. But
that's fantastic.
35 years old, finally cut the rope.
Well, okay, so it's not very long till it shifts because I'm 39 and my parents are now on my plan.
Oh, there you go.
It comes full circle.
That's great.
Anyway. So then I don't know exactly when you transition the responsibility of certain expenses to kids. I haven't gotten there yet. But what I do know is that when you have kids in their 30s and 40s and you are still supplying like regular living, I'm not saying you shouldn't spend money on your kids. In fact, I think most of my clients should take their kids on more vacations and go do fun stuff and create memories and experiences with their money more than they do. But if you are sustaining their lives and to the detriment of your own retirement safety, there's a problem there. And that happens more frequently than we hope.
Yeah. Do you see any common things around that? Is that rent? Is that, I don't know, is that just kind of like a stipend or an allowance almost? Are there common things that you see these parents pulling out of their investment portfolios to give to their kids? Because the kids maybe are in a tough spot, whether that's their own decisions or external factors.
I'm honestly, I'm going to give you what I see the most, but I don't know if I have a great answer because I think I'd probably do the same thing in their situation. But oftentimes it's a kid who gets divorced and they have kids. And my goodness, those grandkids have a soft spot in grandma and grandpa's heart. And so they're like, I'm not going to let my grandkids suffer. I mean, I don't really care about my kids, but I'm not going to let my grandkids suffer. And so then they end up either paying rent or cell phone bills or cars or things like that to make sure that the grandkids are in a good spot.
Gotcha.
And divorce is brutal. And I'm not saying that you should avoid it if you need to. That's your life and your situation. But I'm just saying financially, for a lot of people, especially a non-breadwinner spouse, getting divorced and still having the same expenses can be extremely difficult, and divorce attorneys can be really difficult. So those are things outside of your control. I mean, your kids are gonna date and marry who they think is the best option, and we're not doing arranged marriages, so I guess it's out of your control.
Yeah,
but that's a big one.
That makes sense.
The other one is just it's just parents not willing to let their kids suffer and learn from their own situation. And once again, I'm really, really hoping I don't come across like condescending, because I'm behind you and I have this feeling I'm going to get there and I'm going to do the exact same thing that you're doing maybe. But understand it's a big risk.
Oh, and it seems like just my perception, right, of taking care of the kids' needs when they don't have it versus the kids' wants when they don't necessarily have it are two kind of different things, right? Like if the kids can't do it, that's one thing. If the kids don't want to do it, it might be a different thing.
Yeah, and I've heard different people handle it differently. Like for example, I've had clients say, well, I'm not going to pay your rent, but if you need to come live with me for a little while, that's okay.
Yeah, that makes
sense. That's not as expensive. Your utilities and your food costs are going to go up when they move in. That's not as expensive. My father-in-law is like the most detailed person I've ever met, tracks his investment portfolio every day. We moved in with them for 8 months in between when we got out of a house and got into a new one while we were looking. And he is the nicest guy in the world. But between him and my wife, they had an arrangement where they calculated the difference in utility costs and food bill and things like that. So we were paying him for the difference. Yeah. I just think I love him to death for all of that, because it just resonates with me. But anyway, kids, it is difficult to watch them suffer.
So we've got kind of like the first one, living for the future, is a little bit of a fear-based thing. The second one was a little bit of a lack of discipline. This seems like a love, like you genuinely love someone.
Boundaries, love and boundaries, which are hard to differentiate.
Yeah, interesting.
The fourth one we're actually going to spend probably the last third of our conversation today on, which is the structure of your portfolio, the structure of your income, and how you decide to set that up.
Okay.
So maybe we don't go into too much detail, but it's the don't sell stocks when it's down type of thought process.
Yeah.
And then this last one we talked about, like just not having a good understanding of the ripple effects of your decisions. Like, are you making decisions that you think are good, but you don't understand the third or second and third level of what happens when I go down this path? That's kind of vague. And that's...
Well, I think I can help with this, because in our conversations, this kind of came up of, I have a family member who has been in real estate their entire lives, and they sold a property in retirement. And now there are things that have happened because of the sell and the way it was structured that have ripple effects, not just through taxes, but also now we get into Medicare premiums, and we have all of these other downstream effects from that one experience.
Yeah, and I was a little bit hesitant on this one to include it as another issue, because like even that's not the end of the world. You know, you hope that you're paying taxes. That means you're making money. So like if you end up selling some asset that causes you taxes, I don't want you to pay more than you have to. But if you're never paying taxes, that probably means you're not making money. And that's a problem too. That's probably a bigger problem.
Or you're doing something illegal.
Yeah, a good point. Good point. We're just assuming everyone's doing things legally.
Yes.
And then the Medicare premiums, those can be extremely difficult because they're big, but it's only for a year.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If your income spikes and then drops back down, 2 years later, your premiums will spike and then drop back down. Yeah. So it's temporary. What I'm saying is it's not the reason you're running out of money.
Yeah.
I will tell you, like the one thing that I've seen, like if you could say out of all 10 things, the external factors, the internal factors, you mentioned that it might need a combination of multiple to actually cause someone to run out of money. I know one of them that has caused people, I've watched it draw people's portfolios down to zero. It's the adult children problem.
Yeah.
That by itself. I know I keep coming back to that, but like that's the only one out of all 10 that I've seen that one by itself draw people down to zero.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is spooky because there's nothing these people won't do for their kids and grandchildren.
Yeah.
But you're on an airplane, the air pressure goes down, you got to get your own mask on first before you work on your kids. And anyway.
Well, so we've gone over kind of watch out items, right?
Yeah.
Like externally, you can't control this. 5 things you shouldn't do that you can control. Now, what other things can we do in a more positive light to kind of hedge our bets against all of this?
Yeah. If you can't choose when you're born to get the right sequence of returns, then you can choose to structure your retirement income in a way where some of it is targeting for each risk. Okay. So in other words, the concepts of I don't want to run out of money and I might live a really long time. There are insurance options like annuities, pensions, or taking only the interest from bonds and things like that can last for your entire lifetime. And then the idea of sequence of returns, you can structure the portfolio so some of it has zero loss potential when the market goes down. So what I thought would be best is maybe we just go through. I wrote an article specifically on withdrawing from portfolios called Withdrawal Strategy.
Are you okay if we put this in the description?
Totally.
Yeah.
It's part of a series called Money in Mind. Terry Flint was the lead on a program called the Live Well program with a large hospital in Utah. And when she retired, we contracted with her to say, okay, we'd like you to teach people about like the mental transition into retirement, because you just went through it and you spent your entire career on helping people live mentally well.
Yeah.
And I'll do 7 articles on the financial side of transitioning into retirement. You do 7 articles on the mental side, and those come together into a series we called Money in Mind. And it's about a 60-page book, but each article is 2 or 3 pages. Yeah. And this one is just withdrawal strategy. So the withdrawal strategy idea is the very end. It talks about 2 different types of strategies that pretty much any investment being pitched to you, I would, if I was a consumer, I would first segment it into one of these 2 categories. Is it a now and later approach, or is it a multi-stream approach? So we need to define what that means, but I'm hopefully giving you the framework so now you can have a clear conversation with your financial professional to know, what am I being told to do here?
Yeah.
So in a now and later approach, imagine taking investments in dollars and putting them in a single file line. And I'm going to spend the one at the beginning of the line, and then I'll go on to the next one in line and the next one in line.
Does that mean when it runs out, or just in general order?
When it runs out.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, so it's now money, and then we've got later money over here, and the later money will eventually become the now money, but it has to come through the line. And we hope that the later money grows enough that it creates a new later money bucket at the back end, right? And then the multi-stream approach is, I'm going to still segment into a couple different strategies, but all those strategies pay me income today and forever. So that's a different approach, right? Like, instead of a single file line, it's almost like I've got 3 or 4 lines, and they're more horizontal that way, and all of them are paying me maybe different rates, maybe in different ways, but they all pay me now, and they're scheduled to not run out of money. They're scheduled to last until I die.
Yeah. Tell me if I'm off base with this, because now I'm thinking of like entrepreneurial business income, right? So you kind of have your W-2 income and a retirement, 401k, whatever you want to call it. And that seems like it's the now money versus the later money.
Yeah,
and then you also
way.
have sort of like, if I created a bunch of side hustles that all pay me $2,000 a month forever, that's kind of the multi-stream where I'm not reliant on one, because when that one goes down, I still have several others that are still
You
going.
got it.
Is that, that's just where my brain went when you started describing that.
No, that's absolutely right. That's a great way of conceptualizing it. Let's talk about specifics. So the tricky part, let's talk about stocks for a second.
Okay.
Dividend stocks have typically not grown as fast as high growth, low dividend stocks. So you take the top 5 to 10 stocks in the US stock market right now, and you end up with names like Microsoft and Google and Apple and Nvidia and these names that are high growing, but they're not the dividend payers that companies like Johnson & Johnson and some of the banks and other utilities are, right? An example would be, so I played football in high school just because my friends were there, and that's where, or else I was going to sit at home by myself, right? But I'm a smaller person. If you put me on the line as a lineman, we lose every game, absolute, because they would come right through me every time. But I was shifty and speedy and afraid of people, so I would run and get away from people really quickly, right? So they actually ended up playing me as a quarterback, and we had wide receivers, and you have running backs, and you have a fullback. So these body types need to be different in order to be efficient with the whole team. If you made an entire team of little shifty, afraid people like me, you would lose. If you made an entire team of linemen, you would lose. The point is, when you do a multi-stream, if you're not careful, you run the risk of making an entire team of linemen because they're not fast enough on the growth years to keep up with inflation. but they're doing a real good job of producing current income. So I think that there's some merit in the now and later strategies because you unlock the high growth dollars. You can actually say, I don't need income from you. Go for growth. Keep up with inflation. Help me in 10 years.
Yeah.
And then the near-term money, you can say like, listen, I don't need growth from you. I need you to work hard and give me current income. And it's the idea of positioning on a field, same idea of positioning money in time.
Gotcha.
So I probably lean more towards the now and later money, but I actually like an idea of mixing the two together. But the point is, you're talking to a financial professional and they're saying, you should buy this annuity. It has a really high growth rate and it also has income guaranteed for life. Well, those two things are really hard to achieve. It's like, again, you're trying to make a team of linemen or a team of skinny, small, afraid people. and so those two things are really hard to achieve in one. So either you, like, let's just go back to the 4% rule. If we go, there are lots of different types of annuities out there, lots of different types of insurance. The most common and the oldest, sorry, let me start over. The oldest, not the most commonly used today, but the oldest is like a pension. You give your money to an insurance company and you'll never see that balance again, but then they promise to pay you a monthly benefit for the rest of your life. That's a very straightforward income annuity. That will pay you a lot higher than 4%. So the question is, well, why wouldn't everybody, if 4% is the maximum withdrawal, why doesn't everybody just go buy these annuities that'll pay you maybe 6 or 7% cash flow rates and just call it good? This would be so much easier and no risk of market loss, right?
Yeah.
So I don't mind doing that with a portion of the wealth, but the problem is you don't have enough keeping up with inflation. Now, you could put a cost of living adjustment on that annuity. It'll reduce it down a little bit as to how much they'll pay out, but then you're going up at a very fixed rate and maybe inflation is really high. And maybe we experience 7, 8, 9% for many years. Well, then you didn't predict that. So this goes back to flexibility. I'm not trying to say don't do an annuity like that. I'm just trying to say there's a benefit in diversification in how you get your income too.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk through. You want me to go through some examples, like just, or do we need to probably wrap up before too long? But I think it would be helpful to go through examples in each.
I would appreciate examples in each.
Okay,
Ruby would as well.
Okay, I bet they can't hear the dog. By the way, these mics you have are so precise. Anyway, so now and later money, a bond ladder or a CD ladder. You could set up a portfolio to say, I'm putting in, and we see this all the time. You have let's say somebody needs $2,000 a month. You could take $240,000 and put it into a bond portfolio where 1/10 of it matures every single year. And so that's now and later because you're actually using the principal up. If you decided I'm only going to take the interest on the bond ladder or bond portfolio, that's multi-stream.
Gotcha.
Different approach, same investments, right? But we see a bond ladder or a CD ladder working great because you know exactly what's going to happen. It's going to mature. You're going to take that $24,000 every year and you're going to set it up to pay out $2,000 a month. And then the next year, the next one matures and you just keep going. And then at some point during the decade, you need to decide, we need to take some chips off the table from the later money and create the next tranche of safer money. So that's one option.
Is there a lot of effort in that bond or CD model? Like, do I have to go out every year and buy a certain number of bonds, or what functionally does that look like? Is that something where I could rely on you, like, hey, go do this for me?
Yeah, we do that. Yeah, we do that. I try not to, on your channel, pitch our services too much, but we do that. We do that.
Yeah.
We definitely do that. Bond trading is complex, but not. I would say the most advanced DIYers absolutely can trade bonds.
Because I'm not advanced. And so as you're explaining that of like, okay, you're going to have this percentage on these years and you're going to build this bond ladder, my mind was like, whoa.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's a little much for me to do.
That's fair. So what normally happens is you buy the whole ladder at once.
Okay.
So you're not like constantly like, what's the next opportunity I got to buy? You're buying the entire ladder and scheduling out the maturities for the next decade. Then the difficult part becomes managing it. So that will distribute some cash. And in that scenario I gave, you're getting a bunch of interest and a maturity of $24,000 a year. You're not going to need all that cash. So what are you going to do with the excess cash? Are you going to buy another bond at the tail end? Are you going to, And then bonds sometimes get called. Sometimes things change. Sometimes the rating of the bond changes and you don't feel comfortable with it anymore. So you sell it and you buy a different issuer. So, and sometimes you buy 2 bonds at each rung. They call them rungs in a ladder. It's a bond ladder. So sometimes you buy 2 bonds instead of just one to limit your issuer risk as well. So that's it can be a little bit tricky.
And maybe that's another episode where you can dive into these different things into even more detail. But
I'd be totally fine with that. That'd be great. So an easier option that we've seen people use is a fixed indexed annuity. Same exact concept. You can use a fixed indexed annuity for that. Annuities in general get a bad rap, and rightfully so in some cases. Some of them have fees of 3, 4, 5% and promise you the world, promise you that you'll grow fast and that you'll get a lot of income, and it just doesn't work. But some annuities work pretty well. A fixed indexed annuity could be little cost, and they make money by having your portfolio go up by only a certain amount. So they make money in how they give you interest credits. If you buy a fixed indexed annuity, the word fixed in that means that you typically are not going to lose any money when the market goes down. So okay, let me just give you 3 things about this account type. Typically, and I'm saying typically because there's so many flavors of these, but the ones we've used in the past, don't go down when the market goes down. You probably are going to earn somewhere between 2 and 5% growth when markets on average. But I have seen some of them return in the teens, but that's only like crazy situations in wonderful years like 2019. And anyway, but not going to go down. When markets go down, probably going to earn a bond-like return. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6%. And that's your trade-off. You're not going to make as much as stocks, but you don't lose when the market goes down. And then the third thing is they typically allow a 10% withdrawal. So that's where you could take that whole concept of the bond ladder and simplify it, dropping it into an account like that. And then you could still take out that $24,000 a year without having to worry about maturities. It's just one big account. It doesn't go down in value. You're getting bond-like returns. And there's less flexibility, though. Like if you take more than 10%, they'll charge you a surrender penalty. So a bond ladder, there's no surrender penalty. You just trade it. But there's market risk. So if you trade it before maturity on a bond ladder, you may actually take a tiny bit of a loss if interest rates have changed or gone up. So there's pros and cons to all of these, but these are all now and later strategies. We're still within that now and later category. Another option is a fixed rate annuity. So instead of fixed index, they compare against markets and they'll give you a portion of the growth of the market. A fixed rate, it's not variable on the upside. It's just we're going to pay you 5%. And that feels like a CD.
So if the market makes 15, they're just kind of taking that 10%. Is that what I'm understanding?
Such a great comment. Let's go back to fixed indexed annuity. That is what people think about fixed index annuities. The insurance company's not buying stocks. Even though they're just calculating your return off of what the stocks do, but they're not buying stocks. They're buying a bond portfolio, and then they're buying options to make it so that they can pay what they promised to pay if stocks do well. So they basically say, okay, we can buy this huge bond portfolio with these maturities, and we can make this much money. Let's say they can make 6% or something like that. Then they may say, well, on average, we need to be careful that we can buy the options we need so that, and our option expense is in maybe another 1%. So we're losing 1% of it. It's going to cost us a total of 7%, or you know what I mean? So they get the idea, the interest plus the option premium cost and what they expect to pay out to customers if markets do well or on average based on all of that. And they have really smart people that figure out how to set those caps and spreads in a way that make it so they end up making 1% or 2% in the end. So that's how that works out. Some people think like, oh, they're keeping all the growth. It's like they never even invested in stocks. They just buy a conservative portfolio and then they buy option premiums and make sure that they can cover it. But this other option we're talking about, fixed rate, that's even more straightforward because it's not variable based on how markets do. It's like a CD. You're going to get this percentage. They don't even think about what markets did. It's just like a CD. And then the other option would be more of like, you don't want to handle individual bonds, like bond funds and exchange traded funds. You could buy a bond fund or 2 or 3 or 10, however you decide to structure that. I don't think you need that many. But you could buy a couple bond funds and say, I'm just going to spend from this bond fund portfolio. The downside to that is you are subjecting yourself to everyone else's behavior because we're all pooling our money together in this fund. And if everybody freaks out about bonds and sells them, you will lose money.
Okay.
And so there's risk there, right? So then if you own the individual bonds, I don't care. Like if I own 10 individual bonds maturing at 10 different years, you can go and sell all your bonds all you want. I don't care. I'm just going to hold till maturity. It won't affect me. But if the two of us pool together in a fund and then you end up selling your bonds because you're stressed about bond markets or you think rates are going to go up and you're maybe more of an opportunistic trader and I'm just doing it for safety and income, we have different goals. So I'm not judging you for trading. I'm just saying that impacted me if I'm in a fund.
That makes sense.
So but that's an option. That's an option as well.
And it sounds like you don't really have control over the people going into that bond fund, or is that something where I can say, hey, Zacc, you, my wife, somebody else we trust, let's go in on this?
No, it's thousands and thousands of people that you have no
people.
idea who they are. It's just whoever happens to own the fund through that sponsor.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's no, okay, so those are the main now and later strategies. And when you set up money, I mean, if you look at the markets, the probability of the stock market being positive after 5, 7, 9 years is extremely high. It's because it goes back to that, like sitting at the table, at the blackjack table. If it's positive most years, if we just look at 1 year, if we stretch that out to 3 years and 5 years, and you look at like 20-year periods and even 10 and 20-year periods on diversified portfolios, it's really hard to have a negative return over a decade to 2 decades.
Yeah.
It happens very rarely in a decade period, but it's really, really hard. So the point is, if you do now and later money, you can spend down the first tranche, first section in the single file line, being pretty confident that the money you're not touching for 10 years is going to grow.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And think about numbers too. There's the rule of 72. Divide by 72 and you'll figure out how much. So in other words, let's say you want to double your money. In 10 years, 7.2% rate of return will do it. So that's not that high.
Yeah.
You would think 7.2 on a growth portfolio is pretty reasonable. You could potentially double your money in a decade.
Yeah.
On the later money, right?
Not your
7.2 is a bit much to ask on super, super conservative, low volatility money.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. Unless you have any other questions, let's go to multi-stream.
I don't think so. Yeah, let's go to multi-stream.
Okay, so I mentioned a pension-like annuity. A traditional, like you put money in and insurance company takes it and then they promise to pay a certain amount per month. Huge advantage here if you're hoping to spend more of your money and you're okay foregoing a little bit of the death benefits and things like that. You can actually set up death benefits on those pension-like annuities. You can say, whatever I don't get back of my $200,000 I put in, I want that to go to my kids. That's called a cash refund. I mean, there are options to set those things up.
Are there trade-offs for that though? Like, are you
100%.
giving stuff up to get that benefit of it?
Yeah, they'll just reduce the monthly payment to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like it's just like any insurance quote. You go in and say, I want it to pay for at least 10 years, called a period certain. I want it to pay even if I die, or I want it a cash refund, or I want it single life, or I want it joint life for my spouse and me together. All of those things will impact what the insurance company is willing to pay you on a monthly basis.
Gotcha.
And I think the biggest downside to this is you're locking your money up for life.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty big deal. However, the upside to this is if you were thinking like I can only spend 4%, well, there's an opportunity to like build a multi-stream strategy for what is considered like your essential expenses. And then maybe on top of that, do a now and later money on what you can vary in your more discretionary expenses. So if you know, like, I have to have $4,000 a month, but my Social Security only adds up to $3,000, you might say, it's okay for me to sacrifice some of my overall net worth to guarantee I have another $1,000 a month for the rest of my life. That has some merit and that has some value in giving the flexibility trade-off.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting, not just this conversation, but we go to the Medicare side too, because that's where I live. That peace of mind that people can get is worth something, right? So yeah, you may not be getting everything, all of the potential returns or the big massive gains, but some people are willing to trade that off for just the security and the knowledge that I'm okay. I've got these fixed things covered. So again, we're going to have different people watching this in terms of their mindset of risk tolerance.
Oh, they're going to destroy us in the comments.
Yeah,
We've already established this, right?
Perfect.
I cried 3 times last time. No,
Because the one that mentioned my hair was the one that hurt the most. It was like my hair looked like I just woke up, which they're not wrong, but I'm just...
But leave it out. This is a financial thing. So you make a really good point. There's peace of mind, but there's also the idea of if having that stability allows your risk tolerance on the rest of your assets to elevate, then it's not just a peace of mind thing. It might actually be a mathematical improvement for you, which is interesting to think about too.
Yeah.
So behavior and all of this comes into play for sure. Okay, so we talked a little bit about annuities. Like I talked about the fixed indexed annuity or other annuities. You can add what's called a rider, and I don't know why they call it a rider. It rides along, I guess. Think about it that way. But it's a feature that you throw on top of it, and usually at an additional cost. So they may say, okay, we'll give you this insurance product that has this growth potential, and if you want, we will promise to pay out X%. We'll promise to pay out 5% of the highest value that it's reached for the rest of your life once you start that income stream. In exchange for that, we're going to charge 1% fee on it. And so there's a rider you can add to those. I've done those in the past. I felt like they work in some cases. Some companies will say, we won't charge you any fee on it. We'll just make you wait for a decade in the product before you can initiate it. You're paying with time in that scenario, right?
I mean, you talked about like locking up your money. It seems like that kind of locks it down for something you can't touch for a bit.
And normally those you can touch. You can take the 10% out, but then it affects the income benefit. So there's those trade-offs. And I'm a big fan of like, markets have done great if you have time. So maybe let's be careful about how much we lock up for long-term that way. But going back to the income rider, it works and it works really well. If somebody has a really hard time, like I want the guaranteed income, I do not want to give up my principal in a straight income annuity. And that is a little bit of a middle ground for them. Okay, so then we talked about bond ladders or bond portfolios. If you set up a bond portfolio and you say, I am leaving the principal, and every time a bond matures, I'm going to take that bond maturity and I'm going to throw it at the back end and buy the next rung in the ladder, the next year's worth. So if you have a 10-year bond ladder, and as they mature, you just keep rolling it, and all you do is spend the interest off of it, well, that should be a perpetually running investment for you, right? Because the maturities keep going to the tail end, and you just take the interest. So I would put that method of using a bond portfolio in the multi-stream bucket. Whereas if you're going to spend the maturities, I would put that in the now and later type of portfolio. So it's the same investment. So you can't be like bonds are now and later or bonds are multi-stream. It's the structure of your income that you need to be aware of. And I mean, if an advisor tells you, I'm going to buy this bond ladder for you and it's going to produce your income. Well, my next question is, wait, are we just spending the interest or are we spending the maturities as well? If we're spending the maturities, what's the plan after we've used all of it? If we're just spending the interest, that's it'll take more money because it's interest only. So that then sacrifices how much I can put in the later category to grow and be higher risk. And so that helps people understand how to ask the next question. Dividend paying stocks. This is usually the person who hates bonds. They just hate bonds. They just have the hardest time.
Is there a reason to hate bonds?
Because they don't grow much. They hate bonds because there's a difference between owning something and lending someone money. They'd rather own something. They don't grow. They'd rather own something, and they hate annuities because insurance carriers pay the agents a commission. And so that's okay too. And rightfully so. Some annuities are just awful. They are really bad. So anyway, so are some stocks and so are some bonds.
I feel like you have a lot of feelings about those.
I just get a lot of questions about all this. And I take a different approach. Like I don't think any of it is perfect. And I don't think any of it is necessarily there's no category that's evil, just like there's no category of person that's bad. Do you know what I mean? There are individuals that are not great and there are individuals that are fantastic. And this goes the same way in each category of investment. Bad stocks and good stocks, bad bonds and good bonds, bad insurance and good insurance. Let's go back, though, to people who don't like bonds and insurance. They love the idea of their investment producing them income with a potential for 5 to 10% growth on top of that.
Got it.
And that's fair, but the dividend rate is typically 2 to 3%. And if they pay a higher dividend than that, they're probably a lower growth stock. It's not super common to have a stock like the ones I mentioned earlier in tech and high growth that have had incredible rates of return, but also pay a 5 or 6 or 7% dividend. If you stretch for a 5 or 6 or 7% dividend, you're typically going to be in a more stable, established business that's chosen to pay cash out of the business to the shareholders instead of retain the excess cash and invest in new buildings, new employees, new business lines, new growth. And so there's this trade-off of, well, if they're paying you the cash, how can they grow as fast as another business that's taking that cash and reinvesting it?
Got it. Yeah.
So that's the downside, but the upside is you actually do have a higher growth potential than bonds and annuities. You have a little more volatility for sure, but you also have a lower dividend rate, so 2, 3, 4% probably if you still want growth. Anyway, there's the balance and trade off on that.
There's always a trade off,
right? And then
wish we could have it all. Lastly,
or well, I guess not lastly, but two more: real estate investment trusts, master limited partnership, other income focused funds. This is where I really don't like to go into a ton of detail here because I think your listeners are not asking for these complex of investments, but let's just say there are portfolios designed to produce income, like real estate pooled investments. That's what REITs are, real estate investment trusts, and they're designed to produce income, and they can be fantastic. Here's my only caution against that is REITs pay commissions. Some of them pay commissions like insurance pays commissions. So sometimes you may not know why your financial professional is like, I really think you need to have a lot of real estate exposure. And so, you know what I mean? It's like, I think that the real estate investment trust industry is not, they're not dumb. It's a smart thing to incentivize people to sell your product. But as a consumer, you should understand the financial incentives behind the investments.
Yeah.
And a lot of real estate investment trusts are fairly illiquid. You may or may not be able to get money back out of them, maybe on a quarterly basis. And part of the trade-offs there is that, and the commission will go to the agent, the broker that gave it to you. I'm not saying that it's bad. Some of them have been fantastic, like higher cash flow rates because you trade off. You give away liquidity, you take on some concentration risk, and typically you'll get potentially a higher cash flow rate on it.
Gotcha.
So that could be worth it. Master limited partnerships, that's just another structure that we see a lot of oil and gas investments and things like that in there. Once again, these are all just kind of the extra stuff, but all of them are multi-stream. The concept is not, this thing's going to mature at a certain time or we're going to spend down the principal. They're more designed to create cash flow for you to then spend throughout your life. Yeah, and then I guess the last thing is, I'm going to throw out, this is like the head in sand approach. We talked earlier, and I think maybe we wrap up here. I don't know, Eric, I'm following your lead.
You can call it the Erik approach. Of just
what'd you say?
Throw my head in the sand.
This is the I'm going to sell stocks when they lose money approach.
Great. Let's rename it then.
Okay.
Don't rename it.
So this is not the Erik approach.
I don't want my name tied to that one.
When you have a portfolio that has stocks and bonds and 15 different funds in your retirement account, you think you have a bucket approach, which you kind of do have a bucket approach to investments. You don't have a bucket approach to income. There's a difference there. Okay. This is not now and later money. Like I see a lot of people that leave their money in their old 401k plans and they structure it this way and then they set up a monthly withdrawal from it. And the default method is sell. If they're taking out 5% of the portfolio throughout the year, they will sell 5% from each of the funds within the portfolio.
Yeah.
So during 2020, the market dropped 30% in like 29 days after we all went home during the COVID time. And the month of March and April, those portfolios, anybody who was on that approach, you have a diversified portfolio of funds, and you're taking proportionately from all of them, you're selling stocks at a loss.
Yeah.
And then later that year, the market did okay, and then the next year it did great. And And if you could have just not sold stocks when they were down, you would have made a lot more back.
And that is shifting more of your withdrawals to other investments that are not stocks. Is that the idea behind this?
Yeah. I mean, if you had a now and later approach or a multi-stream approach, either way, you're not selling stocks when they're down, because on the now strategy, you're not investing the money in the next 1, 2, 5, 8 years, maybe.
Yeah.
You're not investing any of that in stocks because that's volatile. And you can't afford the volatility because you don't have time.
Yeah.
And then on the multi-stream approach, you've designed each one to create income, so you're not having to sell the investments at a loss to produce that income.
This brought up a question for me, and again, this isn't me trying to pitch your services at all. It's just this is where my mind is going. Is that, let's say I have a 401k from an employer, and it's got a whatever the amount is. I've retired, and instead of having that 401k managed in that way, is that something where you do take that to a financial advisor, and then the advisor is going to take that chunk of money and put it in a way where what you're talking about here now, where it's not just a 5% withdrawal from each of these, you're going to manage that in a little bit different way. Or if someone wants to do it themselves, they can do it themselves.
Yeah, and I'm all about, like, because if somebody's made it this far in the episode, they may be very DIY. Let's just throw that out there. So I'm going to teach you how to do it. Yeah. And then if you're like, I don't want to do that, for sure my team will talk to you with 14 advisors all busy doing this every single day.
Yeah.
Okay. The hard part about this is, as a wealth manager, it is you have to always be in a very defensible position at any moment as to exactly what you're doing with someone else's money. You can do things with your own money that you cannot do with other people's money, right? So you have to be in a very defensible position. And I think a lot of financial advisors struggle to let the overall allocation drift. Because what happens every year that you spend down the conservative portion of the portfolio, you changed the overall asset allocation, not on purpose, but your portfolio started maybe at 70-30, 70% growth and 30% conservative. But you spent down over 2 years, 10% of the portfolio maybe, right? And the growth money also grew during that time. Maybe you actually didn't spend it down because this grew and it offset. But the point is, your portfolio now looks 80-20 instead of 70-30. And financial professionals struggle with that. They have a hard time being comfortable with the fact that my client's portfolio is more aggressive than it was last year. And if I constantly get too active in fixing that, then that's just the same as selling stocks every month to produce the withdrawals. You know what I mean? So what I'm saying is, in execution, if you're a DIY person, you have to get a little bit comfortable with the uncomfortable portion of letting your portfolio get a little bit aggressive. And then less frequently, this is multi-year periods, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5-year periods, you come back and say, hey, markets are way higher than they were 5 years ago when we set this up. And I think it's time to take some chips off the table. They could still go up more. And I, in fact, expect them to go up more. But this is part of the risk management decision. I'm not doing this every month and selling stocks at a loss when you're taking money out. But if we wait long enough, we are now 90-10 or we're now 80-20 and we should be closer to 60-40. Let's basically take a chunk of the growth and put it in the front of the line. And I don't think of it, by the way, very often in terms of percentages. I'm just trying to talk like other people do and other financial advisors do. I think of it in terms of years. If you are more risk tolerant, you might only feel like you need to set aside 3, 4, 5 years worth of income, and you can go growth with the rest. If you're really nervous, set aside 7, 8, 9, 10 years worth of income, go growth with the rest. And then that's your rule. It's not a percentage anymore. When you were young, think percentages. When you get older, think how many years of a war chest do I need? And then you just backfill the war chest whenever markets are up. If markets are down for a year or 2 or 3, you're going to get uncomfortable, but that's part of dealing with down markets. And your war chest is going to get down to maybe only 2 years worth of cash if it's a really bad market, or 2 years worth of a conservative if it's a really bad market. But after they come back, we'll carve off a piece and put 5 more years there ready to go for the next drop.
That's awesome. That was a cool way of explaining it.
Yeah. Anyway, that's my strong opinion, is that I think people, the bottom line, do not sell investments that are volatile when markets are down. Find a way to do it. The other summary is multi-stream, now and later. That's how you understand what your financial professional is recommending to you. And then the other, I guess the last things that we've gone over are don't overly stress about external factors. You can see how all these approaches can mitigate that risk a little bit. None of those risks are going to destroy you. Your own spending may, your kids may, but maybe that's okay to you because you love them that much.
Yeah. Well, this is awesome. And I know this is at the end, so not as many people will hear this, but I was thinking through my experience. I have a fear of looking stupid, right? So there's a lot of topics or things where I'm not the most handyman person. So I had some sprinklers go out this last year. So I go to the sprinkler store, and there is a reason for me telling this. I go to the sprinkler store, and I'm like, hey, my pump went out. And so they start asking me questions, and I don't know I don't even know where to start, right? Like, what is this defibrillator or decoupler? Like, they're using words where I don't know. And so I felt so dumb, and the person talking to me made me continue to feel that way. Like, just their reactions were like, how can you not know this? You're an idiot. And I'm not arguing with them, but it wasn't the greatest experience. So we see that on the Medicare side all the time. If people are afraid to come to us because they don't want to look like they don't know these answers to something as complex as Medicare. I think the same thing happens with these financial conversations, right? You start talking about all these things that we've talked about, and people are afraid of like, I don't know what this means, and I don't want them to think that I don't know what this means. And what I love about not just you do a great job, your team does a great job, Capita is great, we have other partners that are great. If finding a financial advisor that can take these complex topics, boil them down into kind of bite-sized chunks that make sense in a way that we can understand them. You used a football analogy because I like sports, and so it's like, oh, that makes sense. But I never feel stupid around you. And I hope that other people, whoever you're working with, I hope you don't ever feel like you're afraid to ask certain questions because you don't want to look stupid. Because the only way we can learn is to expose ourselves in a way that, hey, I don't know something, and it's not wrong that you don't know something. You've spent your entire life learning and growing in this knowledge base where mine has been in other places. And so I appreciate you taking the time to break it down this way. Because I think it helps lower the barriers. And if they aren't working with you, if they want to do it themselves, or they have an advisor that they know and they respect and they trust, now they're armed to go into that conversation, not feeling as apprehensive or nervous or, oh, I don't know what I'm talking about. They can come in there like, oh, and now I understand high level what's happening here. And that can help shape that conversation. If you have a client coming to you with at least that base knowledge, I think it would make that conversation more efficient for everybody.
For sure. I think it helps, but yeah, I hope to give people the framework where they don't need to be a financial expert. When I talk to my advisors, oftentimes we'll talk about the concept of we're not trying to teach the client to be a financial advisor.
Yeah.
We're just trying to help them understand their decisions and the options, the pros and the cons, and to move on with their life and to what they want to do and use money as a tool to create their happiness or their goals or their safety, whatever it is that they care about. But that's super nice of you to say. I, of course, love this. My only problem is being long-winded. Not my only problem. One of my biggest problems is how long these go.
Well, it helps you flesh it out a little bit. And we have links in the description to the charts that we're using, everything that we've used. And then Zacc, your podcast of the Financial Call is fantastic. So we'll link to that as well.
So
did you finish up the seasons?
We're close.
Okay.
You're going to laugh at this because we had a lot of people find the Financial Call on YouTube and subscribe after our last video, but we don't post anything to YouTube because we're not as smart as you are. And we did not see that as being beneficial a couple years ago when we started doing this. So if you're listening this far and you really, really want to understand, I have 8 seasons of different topics. This, like income planning, is a whole season, and we did 5 or 6 episodes within each season: investments, tax, charitable giving, business owners, Social Security. Each of these are seasons. They are on things like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the places that your listeners don't like to go. And someday I'll get more on YouTube, but it was a huge mistake, huge oversight. But this is not my world.
Well, as a commenter said, we referenced this earlier. We had a comment where they were like, oh, your hair is perfect and you're just this specimen and you're handsome. And then the other guy, it just looks like he woke up. But I think that's the biggest mistake is people can't see you. They got to be able to see this in action.
We really didn't like video. We hid. Sorry, excuse me. We hid. Apparently can't talk either. But anyway, this is fun. I appreciate you doing it. I appreciate you having me.
Okay, awesome.